Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, and welcome to our next CETAR Europa webinar on cultural factors in international business with Richard Lewis. So we're really happy and glad that Richard could make it today for the webinar, and we're really looking forward to listen what he has for us today. Before we start, I would like to go through very quickly to some technical information to explain you how to use the webinar system. It's quite simple. As you can see, the two main things you have to know is how to hide a control panel. So if you look at the top left of your control panel, you can see like a red arrow. If you can't see the presentation well, just click on it. The control panel will go on the side, and then you can sort of get it back again. In terms of interacting during the webinar, we have the opportunity to sort of collect questions and have Q&A with Richard. So you will be muted during the whole webinars. We have about 100 participants, so it will be quite noisy. So if you have any comments, questions, any technical problems, I will be in the background, so I will collect the questions and then be sort of the moderator to present the questions to Richard. So please feel free to ask questions. We will have like different Q&A during the presentation. Whatever you have questions, just write it right away. So let me just give you a few words about our presenter today. So Richard Lewis is the chairman of Richard Lewis Communications, a consultancy and training organization focusing on cross-cultural issues based in England. He has over 50 years experience living and working around the world, and his book, When Cultures Collide, now it's in its third edition, is used by numerous corporations and business schools to help manage and teach cultural diversity. So Mr. Lewis was tutor to the Japanese imperial family, is a cultural consultant to the World Bank, and was knighted by the Finnish government in return for his services in preparing them for their entry to the European Union. So a really great speaker today. So let me now introduce you officially to Richard, who's going to now start with his presentation, passing over the control to him. And he will sort of go through his presentation for today. So Richard, it's all yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. All my friends in CETAR and anybody else, you're all welcome to sit back and enjoy this session. It'll be about an hour, so make yourselves comfortable. And, well, you can see the title, Cultural Factors in International Business. So I'll get on with it, and as long as I can handle the technology here, we should have a good time. So here we go. Next slide. If we're going to talk about culture, we should try to decide what culture is. Obviously, it's very difficult to define it quickly. I'll have a go. I very often say something like this. It's the culture of a group. It's the end product of millennia of collective wisdom down through several hundred generations, and translated into hardened core beliefs, values, notions, and persistent action patterns. Well, it's easy to define, or maybe it's not so easy, but the next question is, where do we get our culture from? And the usual answer is, well, I got it from my parents. And then we say, where did they get it from? And they got it from their parents. And, of course, we go back in time. Now, I like to teach the culture and any other subject graphically, and if I can. And culture, as you know, is not very easy to draw. But I've had a go. I've drawn a kind of cloud, and I've taken this as an example of German culture, though it could be anybody else's. And this cloud, or better said, a kind of atmosphere, is something which we all have to enter. Well, here is German culture, and the key phrase is, it's lying in wait for them. So all people in the world have wait for them wherever they live, and here you see the newborn children about to enter German culture, the cultural atmosphere tomorrow. Even the unborn children, they're going to come along, immigrants perhaps, but certainly the children go into this cloud or atmosphere, and if they stay there for 12 years, they become German. Because psychologists tell us that we acquire our habits and our real permanent characteristics of character in. So it means that if you live in Germany for 12 years, you're going to On the other hand, at 3 years of age, your parents take you to the United States. You emigrate. At the age of 3 or 4, then you will be not a typical German. You will acquire American characteristics, and you'll enter American cloud, and so you will not be purely German. But if you stay in one country and with your parents from that country for 12 years approximately, it's very hard to change your character after that. And you see here the G coming out of the cloud. It means a German, and later on he or she projects German culture. In other words, they act as a German for the rest of their lives. Next diagram is more or less the same thing. 4 stages. First, innocence, the child, acculturation in the cloud, programmed, and it becomes internal. You become a German inside. And then you see, later on, when you get out of the cloud, the culture is internal, external also, because you're in Germany. Both internal and external simultaneously. It's a very, very powerful thing, and you don't usually escape it. This simply shows that different generations, 20, 30 years apart, but they maintain the cultural characteristics. They remain the same, or pretty much the same, even different. And culture is a collective thing. No one person can know all German culture, or Finnish culture, or French culture, anybody's culture. They can know some of it, quite a lot of it. Maybe they know about the views and a bit about the economy and about the law, but they don't know the whole culture. Culture is known by the collective. It's carried on at the collective level and passed on to successive generations by the whole nation or by the whole cultural group. Now, I don't want to sound as if I'm stereotyping. Of course, when you're talking about culture, one very often has to stereotype to some extent. One says Germans are efficient, Italians are talkative, and so on. We have to be careful, and so I'd like to talk a little bit about stereotyping. If I say the Japanese are ultra, that's a stereotypical statement. Therefore, it is not true. The truth lies somewhere else. To which I would reply, well, where is that somewhere else? Stereotyping does not come from nowhere. Therefore, it must come from somewhere. What is that somewhere based on? And is it true? And then I try to draw it again. You see, the circle there in top, nothing in it, is there? But the circle bottom left is somewhere. And that somewhere contains experience. It contains the history of the country and facts. You go there and you see things for yourself. And therefore, those things provide a stereotype. And as long as it's descriptive and not judgmental, then it becomes a real stereotype, but it is probably a true one, or contains a lot of truth. Now, when I say descriptive, non-judgmental, we can say, for instance, that the Italians talk a lot. And that's correct. But if I say Italians talk too much, then I shouldn't do that, because that's judgmental. And, you know, Italians have good reasons for talking more than, for instance, Finns, who practically don't talk at all. So, brief, but not when they're to analyze a stereotype, you must get inside it. When dissected, you see its complexity and true basis. So, if we look at, let's get inside a German stereotype, well, let's take the Japanese. Japanese are ultra polite, but there are good reasons. One, it shows respect. It avoids loss of face. It's friendly. It avoids conflict. It's moral. It lubricates social contact. It helps business. And if you happen to be a foreigner in Japan, it's rather nice to hear that. It's hospitable. So you see, they have good reasons for being ultra polite. It's a reality. And the source, of course, is that in a crowded country where conditions are very crowded, you tend to be polite to your neighbors because otherwise there will be too many conflicts. And the Germans, well, they're frank. Some people say the Germans are brutally frank. But from the German point of view, it's honest. It avoids unambiguous. It saves time. It avoids hypocrisy. Alles in Ordnung, yeah? It's in conformity with others. it's legal, and it avoid making the same mistake. So when I lived in Germany a couple of years and made a lot of mistakes, I was a broadcaster, they used to tell me, Mr. Lewis, you know, you have einen Fehler gemacht, yeah? And of course, I used to be upset at first until I realized that they were trying to help me. So there are good reasons for Germans being frank and direct. Okay, let's go on to areas of cross-cultural misunderstanding. Culture, we'll always have a few misunderstandings. They're usually in two areas, values and communication. Values, well, what is a German value? Punctuality, you would say. Quite right. Punctuality was not invented in Mexico. So you see that if you have Mexicans working for a German company, the Germans come to the office at 9 o'clock and the Mexicans at 9:30, there will be a clash of values. There will be a collision of cultures. And there, of course, there are many other cases you could quote where different values cause a little bit of misunderstanding. And in communication, you again can have a misunderstanding or even irritation. So the English and the French, who have rather similar values because they have rather similar histories, the British, the French, where they communicate, they wave their arms around too much and have too many facial expressions, whereas English people probably, irritate the French because of their sang-froid. So that, however, we should realize that these are pseudo-conflicts, not necessarily conflicts, and we should try to understand the other side. And, of course, leadership is quite different. Now, I'll pause for a moment and see if we have any questions, Elisa.
Well, so far we don't have specific questions about the presentation so far. I have a couple of questions which are more general that I would rather keep for the Q&A in the end, but I keep inviting people to really write specific questions about the presentation now, and then we keep other questions for the end.
Oh, that's fine. If there are no questions, that means everybody has understood everything, and
right.
That's only good, isn't it?
Yeah, great.
Very good.
Good.
So I'll go on happily.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go. Cross-cultural models. Well, you all know a bit about cross-culture if you're in CETA. Quite well-known models. They are Edward Hall, Gerd Hofstede, Barry Tomlin, Fons Trompenas are four of the best known. I personally began getting interested in cross-culture by reading Edward Hall, who in a way the father of us all. Of course, I followed his model, which was largely dealing with two dimensions, monochronic and polychronic. People who do one thing at a time, and polychronic people who like to do more than one thing at a time. And you know which people these are. I found this quite good, and I started thinking a bit more deeply about it. Obviously, culture is often seen as climate-related. In fact, it is climate-related. If you're on the equator, where it's rather hot, people tend to be polychronic. They tend to do things quickly and like to do several things at once. You get further away from the equator in cold countries. People are more monochronic, do one thing at a time, perhaps a little more slowly. And there is some truth in that, and the influence of climate on culture is considerable. Now, I thought about this, and I thought, well, where do the Asians fit in? Because they're not really monochronic, and they're not really polychronic. You know, there are 4 billion of them. So I felt to have a new model giving the Asians a category of their own. And this is what happened. I created the Lewis model a few years ago, and I found that I could best describe the people of the world with 3 dimensions: the linear active people, who are corresponding roughly to the monochronic people, certainly the ones in the cold countries, Northern Europe and so on. Lively, warm, you know, Italians, or Arabs, or Africans, more excitable people, often living in warmer climates. And then the cooler, reactive people, and I felt that the word reactive described very much the character of the Asians, Japanese and the Chinese and so on, people who react. In other words, they usually like to let the other side speak first and establish their position, and then they reply. usually in an accommodating manner. And this suits their psychology, and it probably helps their business as well. So these are the categories I have persevered with, and I decided to formalize, at least in my own way, the study of cross-culture. And I started off with the categories, and my subheadings, if you like, for studying culture are categories of culture, values, cultural black holes, communication patterns, listening habits, leadership, concepts of space and time. So these are my dimensions, if you like, or at least my study when we look at the culture. And when you formalize the study of the culture in this way, it does help the trainer and even the client, because if you, for instance, study Japanese culture in this way, you can, a few weeks later, if someone comes and said, well, I'm going to Indonesia, you can apply the same formulae, and it helps the student to understand the subject a little better. You don't have to repeat all the terminology. You become familiar with studying culture in this way. So that's how we went on with our processes. And with the categorization is as follows. These are the characteristics. Now you might want to look down these three columns for a moment and decide, and you don't need to belong completely to one. You can be a hybrid cultural personality. Let's look at linear actives. You can probably guess which nationalities there. The people who plan well ahead, polite, rarely interrupt, job-oriented, stick to facts, truth is more important than diplomacy, and so on. Respect officialdom is important. You can probably guess which people these are. In the middle column, you can probably guess who they are. They talk most of the time. They're emotional. They do several things at once. They display their feelings. They confront emotionally. They have good excuses. They often interrupt. They're people-oriented. Feelings are more important than facts. And, you know, they have a bit of flexible truth. Some people will call it situational truth. And they're good at seeking out key people to get done what they want done. And then you have the reactives, and of course these are the Asians. They are quieter people. They listen most of the time. They're good listeners. They're polite but very indirect. They conceal their feelings, and they never confront because they must not lose face. They don't interrupt. Statements or promises. They're very people-oriented. Diplomacy is more important than truth. And they connect the social and professional in their daily lives. Now, we have conducted tests on the web with 28,000 people, the last count, and we have established a kind of league table of nations according to whether they are mostly linear active, multi-active, or reactive. And I'll show you the result of this testing.
Richard, wait, maybe before showing the results, should we launch the poll quickly so people don't get influenced?
Why not?
If you could go back to the slide before. So I would like to ask people to which category do they feel closer to. It would be interesting to see who's the audience. I mean, we have a very international audience. So let me quickly launch the poll. So I invite everybody to vote. So do we feel closer to the linear active, to the multi-active, more reactive, or right in the middle of the three of them, or none of the above? Could you please now, all of you, vote and let us know who's participating, and that would be interesting then to know about your results about the specific countries, so to see whether people felt the same as their own country as you discovered in your study, or whether they have another, and then we can also ask people to write some comments if they want to. So waiting the last few.
Of course, you may find that you're a hybrid, that you have characteristics from all the three columns, but normally you would feel that you were dominantly multi-active or linear active, whatever the case may be.
All right, so a few seconds. Well, 1 second. I'm going to show the results of the poll. I can see that almost everybody voted. So let me share it now. So what we have a very international audience and very various audience. You can see it's a very nice split between linear active, multi-active, some reactive. I don't think there are so many Asians participating because of the time now in Asia, and then some people who feel like being in between. But nobody said none of the above. So I think your categories are quite good, Richard. As you can see, everybody could find his own space within them. So let me continue now and pass it over back to you.
Good. So we'll go back to the league table. Here we are. It's not like a football league table. It's a triangular one. And some things which you might have guessed. There may be one or two surprises, but I don't think anyone will be surprised to see that the most linear active planners are the Germans, closely followed by the Swiss and the Luxembourgers, USA, UK, Netherlands, Norway. They are all very linear active in their behavior. If we look at the top of the diagram, of course, it's no surprise the Latins are the most emotional, multi-active people, the Latins of Europe, the Latins of South America, and the Africans and the Arabs are also of a similar nature, multi-active, talkative, excitable. The family is very important, and they share many characteristics. And then at the bottom of the diagram on the right, you have the Asians. Chinese, Vietnamese, and Japanese are the most reactive. You look at one or two countries like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore who are drifting a little bit towards in the linear direction because they are places which are very interested in money, and money is a very linear thing, very countable thing. If you look at the position of the Scandinavian countries, you have Norway is linear active, but Denmark is higher up, because they talk a lot more than the other Scandinavians. They're definitely more extrovert, so they have a lot of multi-active characteristics. And then if you look down at Sweden and Finland, on the bottom line, they are a mixture of linear active but also reactive qualities. They are good listeners. They are quiet people. They're rather accommodating. And so you see there are a few surprises here and there. India, the right-hand side is in the middle because although they are basically excitable, multi-active people, they're also Asians. They're also very courteous, and they just about strike a balance between the two categories. And of course, it's not surprising that Belgium, on the other side, they consist of two different cultural groups, the Flemish and the Wallon, and they are just about in the middle between the extremes. Okay, well, I mean, one can look at that at length. You could also ask me some questions at the end, but I'll go on. And
well, there are quite some interesting. Yeah, there's quite some nice comments actually. I mean, some people said, well, linear active sounds more like male, and multi-active sounds more like my wife. That's quite an interesting comment.
One thing one must say, you see, these qualities or these dimensions of linear active, multi-active, and reactive not only depend on nationality, they do depend also on whether you're male or female. And of course, the females are more multi-active than the male. And it also depends on your profession. So engineers, mathematicians, and accountants tend to be very linear for obvious reasons. Salespeople, teachers tend to be more multi-active, and doctors and lawyers tend to be reactive because they have to listen carefully to people. So whoever said that is quite right. Women are more, like Rex Harrison said, women are not like men,
Definitely. And in terms of, I mean, there's one specific comment about India, like somebody mentioned that if she feels India being more multi-active and reactive, but of course it depends. You put it right in the middle, that's probably the reason why.
Well, I didn't put it in the middle. They put themselves in the middle because this is the result of testing a few thousand Indians. Mm-hmm. But it is in the middle, and I don't quarrel with that.
Definitely. And actually, some people were curious about how many participants, I think you mentioned it before, how many participants did the survey?
28. Most nationalities, let's say the Germans, we've interviewed about 5,000 and 3,000 or 4,000 French and so on. And some of the nationalities, the numbers are lower. For instance, Hungary, or Bulgaria, we may have had fewer participants, but it's always in the high hundreds at very least.
Right. And some people are curious about whether there is any book or article. I mean, a lot of people are interested in this model, and they're asking.
Well, this model is entirely described in my book, which I'll show at the end of the the presentation, which is When Cultures Collide. And this model forms the basis of When Cultures Collide, and it's a 500-page book, so there's plenty of description and rationale if you get the book.
Right. And can you find also some of the questions you asked in the book? Like, there's people like interested, like really specifically, how do you find out those results? But I guess those are really like specific questions that we can maybe treat also later.
And you can ask me more questions at the end.
Sure,
yeah?
definitely.
Shall I press on?
Please.
Yeah. Very good. These are just extra diagrams that show the same thing. You see, multi-active people tend to be warm, emotional, loquacious, impulsive, reactive, courteous, amiable, accommodating, compromisers, and of course, in Northern Europe, the linear people, cool, factual, decisive planners. Here, when we've tested you, you appear inside the triangle as a dot. And this is a company in Sweden we tested. It was a very technical company, and being Sweden, they were rather linear active, and they came down in the bottom left-hand corner. The 4 people in the middle were interesting because 3 of them were French and working for a Swedish company, and therefore they were more multi-active, and it's only by coincidence that they are in a straight line. And the other person in the 4 was a Swede who had lived in France for 20 years. So you see he had some French influence there. This is the HR department of the World Bank. It's a good diagram from their point of view because there are a lot of people in the middle. So a lot of people are kind of mediators. They have no close affinity with the extreme corners of the triangle. And as World Bank people and especially as HR people who have to travel around the world and meet many people, it's very good that they had this central position. It showed that they are rather neutral in some of their views. You can do other things with this triangle. You trust, bottom right, the bottom left-hand side, trust in Northern Europe or the linear countries is in institutions. We believe in our courts and our law. We believe in our officialdom, and it's based on performance. So you trust someone, what they're going to do. Now, that's quite different from the multi-actives. They basically trust only their family, especially the ones right at the top of the diagram. If you look at France, which is partly multi-active, slow trust based on evidence. And if you look at India, they trust family, but they trust their trade groups as well. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, Asians tend to trust their schoolmates. And they trust reciprocity. If you do something for them, a nice trustful relationship develops. You can also look at truth and see how it applies to people in different categories. Again, bottom left-hand corner, Germany and the rest of us in Europe, truth is, in Northern Europe, truth is scientific. 2 plus 2 makes 4, and that's that. Now, you ask the French, does 2 and 2 make 4, but they deal in situational truth. And they're likely to say, ça va, not quite sure. So you see, truth can very often be situational, not necessarily with mathematics, of course, but with opinions. And in Italy and the northern part of the triangle, I should say the top part of the triangle, their truth is negotiable. We decide what the truth's going to be. We make something which is suitable for everybody. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you have something rather strange. Truth in Japan is a dangerous concept. Now, you might ask yourself, how can truth be dangerous? Well, just imagine, Mr. Tanaka, an engineer, makes a mistake in public in his calculation. And if you, as a European, you say to him directly, Mr. Tanaka, you've made a serious mistake. What happens? He loses face. And this is a thing you cannot do in Japan. Therefore, truth is dangerous. You don't use truth very much in Japan unless it's pleasant. You change it and say something more pleasant. And we would very often call that in some kind of lie. Now, what are cultural black holes? This is a term I invented about 10 years ago. That means that some cultures, they have a certain opinion that is unchangeable. Let's take the American dream. Whatever you tell an American, they always believe that the American dream is true, and you can't change their mind. And the black holes, the cultural black holes, are different in each country. If you look at Japan, the cultural black hole in obsession with losing face. And therefore, because they are very unselfish, cooperative people, and therefore want to lose face, and therefore they, whatever you do, that remains a conviction in Japan. Bit of a black hole, they believe in the French intellectual superiority, based, of course, on their historic influence on world affairs. Therefore, to some people, they appear to be arrogant because of this black hole. They are not necessarily arrogant, but they really feel confident because of their historical influence. And then we come to human mental programming. We said your parents start training you, tell you to what's good and what's bad. And there we have a triangle, which is fairly familiar in the cross-cultural world. You see at the bottom the universal characteristics common to mankind. All of us, and all of you, I think, love your young. You're angry at injustice. You want to be liked. You're grateful for favors, and you want to survive. That is universal. Those characteristics are universal. However, we also have a national program which we have been brainwashed. And so in Germany, you're told to be all those things it says in the middle. Serious, organized, fair, introvert, private. Ordnung is important. Germans have a tendency to complicate things because life is not simple, you know, they say. They are rather intense, certainly logical and reliable. And these other characteristics are all German. Frank, direct, honest, truthful, time-dominated, and they plan well ahead. And, of course, Germans believe in those things because the whole country, the education system, supports, these principles. The French are different. They are precise, rational, socially very formal, but they hate mediocrity. They are charismatic. They are messianic. They're loquacious. They're rather opinionated. They respect education. They're very good orators. They dislike compromise because they believe they are right. They are rather grandiose, and they have superiority. But they are cautious. They seek beauty, form, and style. Those are very good characteristics of the French. They love beauty. They are intense, cynical, and they dislike too many laws. And let's take a typical reactive culture, Japan. Very polite. They don't like losing face. They distrust verbosity. They don't like people who talk too much. They always search for harmony. We notice now in this crisis with the earthquake and the tsunami how they're working together in harmony, how they're showing their selflessness, the desire to be in a group. It's very strong in Japan, even if they're in adversity. They're comfortable in a hierarchy in business. They're a bit uneasy with foreigners because Japan is a rather isolated country. They avoid confrontation, so no one loses face. And they respect older people and traditions. They are serious people, rather shy, and they are ultra honest. So you see three very different categories. Are there any questions?
I can. There's still a couple of comments and questions also referring to the three categories before, and then one question would be about subcultures within one country. Let's again talking about India. Do you have any comments on that? Like, how do you actually deal with the fact that big countries have subcultures within?
Well, of course, in India and China, you will have many regional cultures. The subcultures are largely regional cultures, or they can be ethnic. And, you deal with them. If I wanted to show you all the cultures of India, I would have to do 10 or 20 different triangles. It would just take longer to spell out, the Bengali culture and all the others. In the United States, which is a special case, there are many subcultures. Everyone living in the United States and making a living in the United States has actually contracted with the American mainstream culture. There is such a thing as an American mainstream culture, typical American, even though they may be Italian Americans or German Americans. They may be that at home, but when they enter a working environment, IBM or anyone else, they have to behave like Americans. So subcultures, they exist, and they can be portrayed, but of course we couldn't deal with them all in an hour today.
Right.
Can I go on?
One more comment or question, which is quite interesting, from Andrea, saying, how can somebody like me, a German, having lived in Vietnam for more than 10 years, come better along with culture in Vietnam? Like, is it something you can comment on?
How can you do what with the Vietnamese culture?
Come better along with the culture in Vietnam instead of the German culture, like after living there for 10 years.
When you live in a country for that number of years, I mean, I have lived 5 years in Japan, 5 years in Portugal, 5 years in Finland. You tend to learn something from that culture. You tend to certainly learn about the positive elements in the culture, and you tend to adapt a little bit. It doesn't change your basic behavior, but let me say, for instance, that when I'm living in Japan, I'm rather more polite than when I'm in England. And when I live in Germany, I was rather more direct than Italy, for instance. So you can adapt as a tribute or as a compliment to the culture you're living in. But basically, you know, you have your hidden agenda in your head and you remain. All right?
Sure, great.
Can I go on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot.
Within horizons. Now, if we are dealing with another culture and we want to get on with them, we can use a rather useful diagram, and that is the horizons diagram, which, again, I invented about 10 years ago. If you imagine the eye on the left being an American eye, looking at an American horizon, he or she sees only American concepts and values. And the French eye, looking the other direction, sees all the French concepts and values. In other words, a French world. Now, those two worlds, although very different, do little bit because France and the United States are both Western liberal democracies. Therefore, some concepts and values are going to be in common. And if we fill it in, it looks a bit like this. Now, you see that the differences are quite staggering, really. I mean, informal manners, formal manners, first names, surnames. Americans are interested in facts and figures. French are interested in ideas. Americans have dollar status. France, you have status by family or education. Americans put their cards on the table. The French hold them close to their chest, and so on. Look at the bottom, you see. Haute cuisine in France. In America, well, McDonald's, fast food, which is also part of culture. So you see, they are very, very different countries and cultures. But if you look at the middle, they both had revolutions. They seem to be quite proud of them. The same system of justice is more or less the same. Liberté, égalité, and fraternité in France, and certainly are very important in America, as are freedom of speech and concepts of liberty. Consumerism is common to both. Science, there are no problems. Art, Americans love Matisse and Renoir, and French people love Hemingway. Technology is the same in both countries, or similar, and both countries believe that our way. Outside those two cultures, you have some commonalities. Modesty, you know, did you ever meet a very modest American or a very modest Frenchman? Again, perhaps you did, but we're looking at the generality. So this is useful, this type of diagram. You try to find as much as you can to put in the middle, because then you have a basis for doing business with and improving, you know, your relations and your business relations with someone of another nationality. Sometimes it's very hard. If you put Sweden at one end and the Arabs at the other end, it's very hard to find something to put in the middle. What they have is much easier for two countries like Sweden and Norway. They would have 100 things to put in the middle. So try that out with some of the nationalities you deal with. Now we come to national communication patterns, and every country, every culture communicates in a different way. And there are big differences. So let's take as an example of the difference, the most talkative people in Europe and the least talkative people in Europe, the Italians and the Finns. If we look at a diagram of Italian-Finnish business meeting and the Italian speaks first, let's say he's a man, the approach will be verbose. Let's describes the project, 5,000 words. The poor Finn, who's not used to so many words, miscomprehends or says, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean, Giovanni. And Giovanni then will explain in 10,000 words what he meant by the first 5,000. And after that, we're not sure where the Finn has got to, probably under the table. But the Finn in reply is a very different kettle of fish. The Finn would say the more or less the same thing as the Italian, similar proposal, but in 300 words, which take 2 minutes or 3 minutes, not more. And the Italian, who doesn't necessarily listen for the first 3 or 4 minutes, will say, look, I don't quite understand what you meant. Would you explain? Now, a Finnish male is not now going to use 10,000 words like the Italian did to explain. Used his 10,000 words in a lifetime. So he's more likely to summarize and say, well, Giovanni, what I really meant was, A, B, and C. So the Italian is listening, A, B, C. He's waiting for the rest of the alphabet, and the Finn sits down, and this is not a very successful communication. Now, you may find it's not true, but this happens almost every day in Brussels, at the European Union, where sit on committees with Italians and Spaniards. This happens almost every day, that they find it very hard to understand people who use thousands of words, and they get in and say things of their own. And of course, I've had a lot of experience with training Finns for the European Union, and the feedback I'm getting is that this situation, unfortunately, still exists. There are other communication patterns. The Americans like to put their cards on the table. If you don't like them, they spell it all. If you still don't like it, they confront and provoke, use sarcasm and kidding, because an American wishes to do the business as soon as possible. And so they can get almost a bit rude, because in America, a fight is communication. And at the end of the afternoon, they'll probably, in order to do business, they will make concessions, conciliation, and it still works, but it doesn't always fit in exactly with the pattern of communication of like Germans and French, who tend to be rather formal. The British people are not so straightforward as the Americans. We're a little bit devious. I'll say we, because I'm British, of course, English. And, we're rather more casual, 5 to 10 minutes small talk, a cup of tea, and then we casually introduce the business. I suppose we ought to look at a few papers, this kind of thing, and we make a reasonable proposal because we try to appear reasonable. And if you object, we keep calm, we use an understatement, we say, oh, we seem to have a little problem, and we use coded speech, which basically means we say the opposite of what we mean. And I'll give you some examples in a few minutes. We use humor to get out of deadlock. We can have a recess, go and have some more tea, and come back and do some repackaging. In other words, we have not a very straightforward style. I'll show you now some examples of coded speech, which what we say is quite different from what we mean. So if someone puts a stupid idea on the table, we'll say, that's a stupid idea. But an Englishman would never be so impolite and would say, interesting idea. But what he or she really means is, what a stupid suggestion. And when we say, you could say that, and about this idea on the table, I say, well, Hans, we must have an idea. We must have a meeting about your idea. And Hans says, oh, really? Can we discuss it further? And we say, we shall certainly consider it, which means in English, but poor old Hans, who is an honest German, goes back to Germany and he says they thought our idea was very interesting. They're going to have a meeting about it, and they're going to consider going ahead with it. Whereas what we've said is, what a stupid suggestion, forget it, and we won't do it. So you see, this is a very dangerous thing for people doing business with English. You have to know this way of talking. Of course, Europeans and others who come to England and work in the UK for about 6 months, they get used to this way of speaking, and they even use it themselves. But it's something you have to think about if you're going to work with English people. So, for instance, when an English person says, I agree up to a point, that means I disagree. Here are some more examples. I'll let you read them. It's very easy to misunderstand. So when an English boss comes into the room and says, let me make a suggestion, what he's really saying is, this is what I've decided to do. And if an English manager says, correct me if I'm wrong, whatever you do, don't correct him, because what he's actually saying is, I'm right, so don't correct me. See? Anyway, you'll get used to that if you go and work with English people. Good luck. Now, people communicate in different ways, and they also listen in different ways. There's an American listening pattern, there's a German listening pattern. There are many. In every country we have one. Let's look at one or two. What's the American listening pattern? First thing an American wants, if he or she is in the audience, is entertain me. Tell me something funny, or at least something very interesting. Entertain me, because we only listen in snatches. And if you entertain me, you tell me a nice little joke, for instance, I'll then listen for about 20 minutes. And after that, they become very business-like in the listening pattern. What's new? Time is money, so get to the point. Give me facts and figures and keep it simple. If you're going to sell it hard. And by the way, what's the bottom line? Now, the German listening pattern is very different. Germans listen much more cautiously. They need the past history and context of what you're talking about. And then what it's all about, they take things literally. No jokes, please. We're German. No jokes, no hard sell. They're not necessary in a business discussion. By the way, what's it cost? This sounds a bit too simple, perhaps. And by the way, what happens if? So this is very cautious listening, very different from the American. And you have to take that in mind if you're addressing Germans. If you're addressing French people, because they're very confident and they think they know already what you're going to tell them. And don't forget, French is best. So don't try to sell them a Japanese car if they have a Peugeot. They also expect some panache from the speaker. They expect logic, and they have busy minds. They can be thinking of other things. So French audiences are not easy, but if you want them to listen to you, you have to tell them something early on that they don't know. And if you do that, they then listen very carefully because they're very intelligent people who like to analyze things. Russians, because first of all, they're suspicious of foreigners. They're interested in them, but they're suspicious of foreigners, and they're particularly suspicious of official information. And of course, you can understand that after 70 years of communism, when they were told things which were not exactly true. But if you have a personal touch with them, and you say, I, Pierre Dupont, or I, Jack Smith, tell you, Sergei, that this is true, they're more likely to believe you. But you can't speak to them as an organization. They much prefer to believe in individual people. In Italy, it's a good audience, the Italian audience. They're friendly. They need sentiment. They want imagination. They're watching you besides listening. They're evaluating you. Basically, they're trying to construct a relationship based on what you say and how you say it. And if you want to have an Italian audience with you, you have to be very friendly, and then you will have no problems. Hungary, they are more difficult. They switch on and they switch off. They need humor. They need charisma. They need challenge. They need brevity. If you're interesting, they listen. They switch off. They want to speak themselves. They start talking to each other. They can be a bit too, being ex-communists, are suspicious of official information. So not an easy audience. Finland, very good audience. They say nothing. They listen carefully. The only thing is they need a cup of coffee to start. In Finland, you buy an audience's attention with a good strong cup of coffee, and they will listen there for 1 hour. If you want them to listen longer, you have to provide another cup of coffee. Again, the Finns are quiet people, and you don't get any feedback. If there is no feedback, it means that they approve of what you said.
Richard, I have one comment. Somebody was asking about, if you could make a couple of comments just briefly about the Japanese communication and listening patterns. I know it's not part of the presentation, but maybe would you have a couple of comments about that?
Of course. If we take, first of all, the Japanese community and the speech habit, they will, like the Finns, say rather briefly what their proposal is. And then when you object to it, you turn it down in a sense, instead of changing their proposal, they will repeat it bit like the French did. And the French repeated it because they felt, they were right. The Japanese repeat it because even though they're speaking as individuals, they're always representing the company, Mitsubishi or Mitsui or Sumitomo. And the Japanese is not able policy simply because you don't like it. So they can only repeat it, and then if you turn them down a second time, they say, well, we'll have to meet again tomorrow, and during the night they talk with Tokyo. Now that's the speech habit, rather reserved. The listening habit is they are perfect listeners. They listen to everything you say. They never interrupt, but they hardly understand anything you say. So that's a problem. It's very few Japanese, especially sitting in large numbers in Japan, understand a foreign speaker. Therefore, you will have to have your speech in writing, and you give that to them after you have delivered it orally.
Great.
Is that okay?
Thanks. I mean, I will, to the other people who are asking for other countries, I will say that I'm sure they can find those in your books or like...
They're all in the book.
Exactly.
It's 500 pages long. And I have another book with 360 diagrams, which I'll tell you about at the end of this presentation.
Exactly. Just one really interesting comment. Somebody was asking whether professions like IT, software engineering, or academic, if they have also specific communication and listening styles, or if they belong to a specific category in terms of multi-active.
Well, IT people and scientists and so on, they tend to be rather linear active because, you can imagine a salesperson has to be very imaginative and personable, and they tend to be multi-active, human. I don't mean engineers but this type of person who is technical in different ways tend to be rather linear active because they rely very much on facts. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Wonderful.
Can I go on?
Yeah, please.
Well, there are about 300 cultures in the world, and there are about 300 different presentation styles, but you can't learn them all. So what we try to do is tell people, learn two basic styles, one of which is rather reserved and the other is rather extrovert, and practice those two styles if you're presenting your company. And if you're doing that in the UK, Germany, and the Nordic countries and nations, have the reserved style, which they like. And if you're selling something hard, use the other style, the extrovert style, and that goes down better in the USA, in Latin countries, in Australia, and among Arabs. And if you use the wrong style, in the wrong country, then you will not be effective. Leadership styles, of course, vary from country to country. We have all kinds of leaders. We have kings, we have dictators, we have parliaments, we have mullahs, all kinds of leaders. And here are some diagrams. The most democratic leadership in the world is in Sweden, where the manager is always the one in yellow, sits with the staff, and they decide things by consensus. That's the most democratic management style in existence. The opposite of that is in France. It's very autocratic, and of course the French manager, the PDG Général, or whatever he is, Président Directeur Général, he will send his orders downwards, and he expects them to be obeyed. In Germany, it tends to be a bit of both. They're very hierarchical, but they also consider their workers and consult their workers a lot because German workers are often, as you know, very well educated. In the United States, American managers are always telling you how they're individuals, they can make decisions, but one must never forget that it's very structured individualism. That is to say that American managers have to report always to the country manager very strictly, and the country managers have to report to HQ in the USA, and it's very often with rolling quarterly form and standardized accounting systems, which are not easy to deal with. I've had to deal with that myself, and so it's not as individual as it seems. In the UK, the manager is usually just outside the circle of executives. He's not sitting among them. It may be a class difference, it may not, but he is ready to listen to them. He's not far away. In Russia, leadership officially is, vertical, of course, especially in state companies, but of course, of apathy at the bottom, but most Russian leaders have a personal approach with a sub-lieutenant there in the middle, sub-team, and they get things done in rather a private way, even though they are officially running the company in a very vertical fashion. And a lot of communist countries, ex-communist countries, do this. Finland, the strong man or strong woman concept is very popular in Finland. The manager is outside the group, but when there's a crisis, they jump in, they help out with the crisis, and then they get out again. Concepts of time, well, you can expect linear active people to do things in a straight line, A, B, C, D, E, F. They don't like doing B until they've properly done A, and then they go on. They've done the lot, they go home, and they watch television. The multi-actives and the reactive don't use time like that. They tend to put the same 6 tasks in a kind of pool and walk around the pool and consider things in a more leisurely manner and not necessarily do them in a fixed order. And later on they will do some of them, leave others undone, maybe think of something new like G in this diagram. And so it's a different way of using time. And managers considering strategy very often have to use the second system. Then we have concepts of space. You know that you have your distance of comfort. Some people like to talk to each other at a distance of 50 centimeters. Others require twice that space. I'll illustrate this with some photographs. This is a bus queue in a Latin country. It's actually Portugal. And you will see in this bus queue that people are standing very close together. Their shoulders are perhaps touching. It's a friendly atmosphere. They are talking to each other. Their distance of comfort is 2 or 3 centimeters. Apart from one man at the end, they're all very close to someone else. And they're all comfortable with that. In this country, which is a country not very near the Latin countries, they queue in a very different manner. Now, I took this picture to Brazil in São Paulo. Brazilians asked me, what is that? I said, it's a bus queue. And they said, well, no, it isn't a bus queue. I mean, it can't be. They said, why is the woman not standing next to the bus stop? I said, well, because in this country, if you're first, you don't like to be first, so you allow about 15 meters. And they said, well, is that man afraid of her in red? And I said, because people don't like to be crowded. But they said, nobody's talking to each other. I said, but they don't talk to each other in a bus queue in this country. And they said, you know, did you take the picture of the bus queue? And I said, yes, I did. They said, well, if you take a picture of a bus queue in Brazil, everybody faces the camera, waves their arms, smiles, and says, hello, and so forth. You see? I said, in this country, if you take a picture of a bus queue, they turn their backs to you. I'm sorry, but that's what they do. And the Brazilians said, well, you know, they're very strange people. I mean, they don't like to stand next to you. They don't talk to each other. They don't look at the camera. But they're very strange. They leave 15 meters between them and the bus stop. But we know one thing about them. They are very honest people. And I said, yes, they are. But how did you know? They said, well, in São Paulo, if you leave that black bag there, and they didn't finish the sentence, which, of course, I know what they mean. Now, if you think that this, by the way, is a picture of Finland, Helsinki bus station, and if you think that this is not true, I'll show you another bus queue, picture another bus queue in Finland, which is this one. And there we are, 5-6 meters between each person, and queuing on both sides of the bus stop. So I think that should convince you. Well, to sum up in a way, you know, people are very often asking me on seminars, are cultures getting closer together, or are they diverging? And of course, most people think they're getting closer together, converging. And I have to tell them, microculture, in certain respects, it is converging. We look at the media, they ask us to dress the same way, we eat the same food, we're all like music, we can agree about sport, football particularly, and trends. And the multinationals want us to report in the same way, to have things like Schengen to help us to standardize our culture. But these are what we call microculture. If you look on the other side at macro-level culture, where very serious personal things like religion and ethics, morals, the concept of truth, and advertising, personnel policies, you can't standardize these things. And in many cases, you'll find that culture is actually diverging. I'm sorry to say this, but nevertheless, you know, it's a diverse world, and that's what we have to consider. Therefore, I wrote a book called When Cultures. I point out that cultures are very different. They're not necessarily converging. They leading across culture has to bear that in mind. If you are an American manager leading a French staff or vice versa, you bear in mind what happens when cultures collide. This book has had rather a lot of success. It was published in 96, second edition 99, and of course a much bigger 500-600 page edition in 2010. You can get it anywhere on Amazon and other places. It won the US Book Award of the Month Club Award in 1997. It's now considered a classic, and it's been translated into 12 different languages. Another book called The Cultural Imperative after the first one, and this talks about the future. What are the global trends in the 21st century? Not always easy to know for sure, but I had a stab at it, and this book also is rather interesting. Here, someone was asking about diagrams. Well, this is a book I published very recently, for communication, a visual approach. Now, you know I like teaching concepts visually, and I decided to put all my diagrams in one book, which are in When Cultures Collide and in other books, and there are 360 diagrams showing how people conduct their lives. And to give you one or two examples, you can have a peep at these. These are showing differences in communication style in those three countries. These are showing leadership styles in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Turkey, Iran, and Israel, you know, how do they lead? There are 360. There's another one. And then I wrote a book called Humor Across Frontiers, so we can all have a laugh. People have different senses of humor. Some people say the Germans and the Japanese don't have a sense of humor, but it's not true. They do. But it's a particular form of humor in each country. And I try to show the differences in this book. And this book has not yet been published, but I have written it, Managing the International Team, so keep your eyes open for it in the near future. We have a web cultural assessment where you can find out your own personal culture by answering a couple of hundred questions. And on that online program, Culture Active, we have 100 national cultural profiles which you can bring up on the web and compare one with the other, all the way from Argentina to Zambia and everything in between. We have training courses for cross-culturalists. We give a certification in the Lewis model for trainers and coaches who take it. They're quite popular. We have one every 3 months, and they are 3-day programs in England, Riversdown House in Hampshire, not too far from Winchester, and of course all accommodation and food provided. And for further information on any of those courses or books or anything you want to ask us, there you have our details. It's been very nice talking to you. I wonder if you have any questions, and I shall sit here and wait for them. All
Great.
Right, Elisa?
Yeah, thank you. All great presentation. I mean, we do have still some questions. I thought maybe we'll answer a couple of them as time is sort of running out and we don't have much time left. So one was actually somebody was really interested in knowing how do you see the relation of your model with the Hofstede's model? I guess it's a question that you've heard many times. You said that many description of this collective programming probably make him thought about the Hofstede's model.
Well, it's hard to make comparisons. They are very different models. My model is, of course, much later than Hofstede's. I think Dr. Hofstede's was about 35 years ago. My model is based on current information. We are conducting information tests all the time. Let's say in the last 10 years, most of the information has been collected and from very different sources, not from one company, but from nationality, from 67 different nationalities, and probably there are about 500 companies involved. Mm-hmm. And of course the dimensions are very different. Dr. Hofstede has 4 or 5. I think von Strampenas has about 8 or 9. We have 3. So there are big differences, of course. We have tried to make ours very user-friendly because we find that training officers of companies want something that they can use in a very practical way, and that was thinking behind how we wrote our model.
Right, great. And one interesting question from Anna's asking, how does the culture mainstream change? Like, does a study has an expiration date? And if yes, after how long? Or how do you deal with that?
I'm sorry, I didn't get out of that. How does a culture change?
A culture mainstream change, like a culture for a country, how does it develop throughout the time? Like,
Well, the first answer is at a glacial pace. In other words, cultures change very slowly, not over weeks or months or even years, but over decades or over centuries or over millennia. You know, the Chinese culture has been developing for 5,000 years, and they change very slowly. It's sometimes a traumatic event can cause a country to change direction a little bit. Certainly that was the case in 1945 with the atom bomb in Japan. The Japanese culture did change because of that traumatic event. Mm-hmm. And the occupation of Germany and the division of Germany and the German period of before they were reunified, it caused East Germans to differ considerably from West Germans. But these are isolated events in history. Normally, modernized, a lot of it is technology. The basic culture changes very little.
Mm-hmm, great. Well, I think we're sort of running out of time, so I guess there's still a couple of questions, but I'm quite sure they could find the answer in your books. I mean, you provided us with the names and titles and everything, so I guess it's going to be a lot of answers there. They can also contact you. I mean, they have the email address of your company, so they can also, exactly, so that should be fine. So it's been a great webinar, Richard. I mean, I'm really glad that you could take the time to sort of present us with a lot of insight. It was really a very interesting webinar. I would like to close down very quickly. Let's see, with just a few information about the next Congress, CETAR Congress, is going to take place in Krakow. Richard, you told me you're going to also participate, which is great to hear. And we will, basically it's going to take place on September 21st to the 25th in Krakow, Poland. There is I'm sort of sharing with you also the website, so you can find all the information on the CETAREU.org website, and the same thing will be for the recording of the webinar. If you check in the next few days on the website, you will also find the recording of Richard's webinar, like in case you want to sort of see some slides back again, it's going to be a recording in video format. Great. So I guess that was it from my side and from your side. So Richard, thank you again for your time and for the great time.
You were a lovely audience, even though I couldn't see you.
They were very active, so thanks a lot for all your comments and questions. Sorry we could not answer all of them. So wish you all a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.